Um, as you've heard, today I'm talking about negative theology and love, and I changed the topic of the paper about 8 weeks ago. So this is a venture into the unknown for me as well. So I am basically trying to demonstrate that the two concepts go very much together, and I've simply chosen Marguerite Porete as an illustration of that fact. Now, as we all know, negative theology is a popular discourse in today's philosophical and theological circles. And as I said the other day, I think the contemporary interest in negative theology, such as we find it in the works of Jean-Luc Marion, Jacques Derrida, J.D. Caputo, Dennis Turner, Richard Carney, etc., is better described as philosophical apophaticism, in that it uses negative theology to assassinate the great monster they call ontotheology. The negative theology I am talking about today is rooted in theological discourse and spiritual praxis. Negative theology, like love, cannot simply be said. It's done. When I first thought about the concept, I thought it would be very difficult to bring them together. And then when thinking more deeply about it, I realized that both love and negative theology are ecstasies, a going out of oneself. Love is ecstasis, in the going out of oneself into the heart of another. And ecstasis is also the central moment in a negative theology that is practiced. The displacement of self, as one's heart empties itself to make room for the other, is paradoxically a filling of the heart, not only with the other, but with the self. Excuse me, I need a watch. In case I ramble a little bit too much, I need a watch. In similar fashion, I think God's knowing of God's self, when God is, as it were, manifest in creation, is the only knowing of God that God can engage in. God cannot know God's self outside of creation. I would like to suggest that in the going out of the self, to make one's home in the heart of a friend, a lover, that very displacement becomes completion. At the deepest level, when my heart resides in the heart of another, when love has displaced me into the heart of my friend, my lover, I am no longer me, but me in my love, in my lover. A different me whom I cannot really know, because I'm no longer me, but me in other. This is an apophatic or aphoretic moment, as my self is neither me nor other. Just as in the ecstasis of the apophatic moment, love makes of two candles one light, or from many candles one light, love makes a duet that is different from each of the voices that sing alone, and this may not be fully comprehended by an individual light that is part of the light, or a singer who's part of the duet. You don't get the whole picture. As in Dionysius, the one who loves is drawn out of himself and centers his being on the object of his love, and love is ecstatic because it is unitive. The lover is united to the beloved. I want to show today that love causes self-displacement, and that the apophatic plunge, the jump, the breakthrough, the annihilation is a love-inspired moment. I will attempt to do this by exploring the works of Marguerite Porete, whose fiery words, unfortunately, earned her a very fiery end. And those of you who have read the little quote from Rumi on the back of the little card, that sums up precisely what Porete and her work is all about. And in fact, her anniversary is next Monday, so I'm thinking of her in a special way because she was burned at the stake in the Place de Grève in Paris in 1310 on the 1st of June, and she was the first woman mystic to have been put to death because of her authorship of a book. I will also make frequent reference to Meister Eckhart because I believe that he was deeply influenced by Porete's Mirror of Simple and Annihilated Souls. That's the title of the book, The Mirror of Simple and Annihilated Souls. And I hope we shall see in Porete's writings that the apophatic plunge that is love-fueled involves an absolute relentless going out of oneself until the self is no more and the self can no longer be found. But first, let me begin with a very brief outline of my approach to negative theology. I believe that the ultimate aim of a negative path is unity with the one, with the good, with God. And as Plotinus would put it, by reversing our way of thinking, we simply leave ourselves open to the vision and presence of the good. A negative theology that is understood from within the context of the great twofold journey of katabasis and anabasis, kenosis and theosis, of God becoming human so that human can become God, is one of the central thematics that I want to touch on today. So according to followers of the negative way, knowledge is an obstacle to be overcome in the path to God, because knowledge casts a veil of clouded particularity around the one, the good God, but the subsequent stripping bare or unveiling, the aperikalyptos of Dionysius, paradoxically reveals nothing because God is no thing. The unveiling simply leads to an unknowing knowing, a plunge into the divine, or simply being in the same place as God. The end of the negative journey, therefore, is not an empty space neatly fenced by negative dogmas, as Arthur Hilary Armstrong put it. And here I let the poet Rainier Maria Rilke take over. But though my vigil constantly I keep, my God is dark, like woven texture flowing. 100 drinking roots all entwined, I know that from his warmth I am growing, more I know not. My roots lie hidden deep, my branches only are swayed by the wind. In a cosmic perspective, then, we could say that the no-thingness of God becomes something when, through creation, through love, God's ecstatic love in creation, that God becomes other than God, because creation out of nothing is creation out of God, ex Deo. So God can then be known only when other than God or not God. And it's creation as theophany, as the alterity of God, that enables the simultaneous knowing and unknowing of God. In this dialectical way of understanding the unfolding of God, the oxymorons of the apophatic theologians begin to make sense. Silent music, John of the Cross, bright darkness, unknowing knowing. And in my own view, I agree with Balthasar that the going out of God into otherness is much more interesting than the return of all things to their dark, unknowable source. In creation, a being can say, I am not God, I am God's otherness. God becomes when all creatures say, God, then God comes to be, as Eckhart put it. Creation is itself the affirmation that it is not God, because it is something other than God. And paradoxically, Eckhart suggests that creation creates God. I'm glad you're not a jury of inquisitors, because you would be getting your matchboxes out at this stage. Now, used as we are to understanding the God from either the perspective of transcendence or the perspective of immanence, formulations such as unmanifest manifest, invisible visible, stretch the mind in both directions simultaneously, because one cannot really for us be understood without the other. God is both all things and not anything. The idea that God is manifest in creation is true, but the fact that God remains transcendently unmanifest is also true. And yet neither are true when understood singly. The problem, as it were, is resolved by coupling both truths in a dialectical formulation which reveals the tension between and the simultaneous truth of both. The truth of the statement, God is all things, is constantly undermined by the basic distinction between God and creation, which is a forceful reminder that, as an apophatic understanding demonstrates, a comprehensive account of reality can never be attained. As Michael Sells put it, the authentic subject of discourse slips constantly back beyond each effort to name it or even to deny its nameability. Eriugena's central and indeed most audacious truth, as put forward in the Periphousion, that all things are both eternal and made, is the ultimate apophatic truth at both the linguistic and ontological levels. Listen to Eckhart. But if God is neither goodness nor being nor truth nor one, what then is he? He is pure nothing, he is neither this nor that. If you think of anything he might be, he is not that. So where will the soul find truth? Good question. I think the answer could well be in the journey, and it's different for each individual. So who knows what to say, what it is when discourse comes to a halt? But of course, the Meister has an answer for the soul who asks, what then shall I do? He says, you should wholly sink away from your you-ness and dissolve into his hisness, and your yours and his become so completely one mine that with him you understand his unbecome isness and his nameless nothingness. That passage always blows me away. I'm not going to read it again because it would take a whole half hour to get through the whole thing. So the unity that is the force of the negative way, when it's taken to its limits, can be described from the perspective of Moses ascending the clouded mountain, or the blinded Dionysian soul throwing itself relentlessly against the ray of the divine darkness, or, as in Eriugena, a cosmic adunatio, or as a standing naked and empty and waiting for God, as we find in Porete and Eckhart. And I think that negative theology will never be the sword that will do away with the particularity of, in the Christian tradition, the incarnation. And yet, in another way, it is, because the work has been done. The Logos returns to Sige. So today I want to show in the two authors, particularly Marguerite Porete, the intellect concepts of negative theology and love are complex, but that a Godhead behind the God that we have negated, the hid divinity, is never exposed. Using negative theology as a knife to cut away idolatry is a necessary part of all theology. But the cutting away does not reveal Rather, it takes us someplace, and that place is straight into God. Those with faith can let go, break through, be annihilated, but they don't then fall into the abyss or remain in the desert of no-thingness. They can, quite wonderfully, be changed into God. As the Jesuit poet Gerard Manley Hopkins put it in his wonderful poem, The Windhover, blue bleak embers, ah, my dear, fall, gall themselves and gash gold vermilion, when the embers that are on the dying fire, the coals, look to be dead, and suddenly they fall and you see sparks coming out of them. I think that's a very nice analogy for what I'm trying to say. But just as no two loves are the same, except in that all love is praxis, no two lives are the same and no two spiritual journeys are the same. There can be elements of similarity, but there will always be difference. And so it is with practitioners of the negative way, not least with Marguerite Porete and her contemporary, the Dominican, Meister Eckhart. In both cases, words are at times strained to their limits as they attempt to put into expression that which is expressionless, in that place where you-ness and me-ness disappear in unity. I've already mentioned that the self-death of the lover through love, which has an apophatic thrust, and I want to illustrate what Marguerite Porete means by that. The whole work is an allegory in the courtly love tradition. The main speaker is Dame Amour, the voice of God. God himself is loin près, far near, and reason and soul are among the other speakers in the dialogue. The work is written in the vernacular and goes a little beyond a century because it's 122 chapters that are a mixture of verse, prose, lyrical passages, and animated debate between the characters, especially Amour and Reason. And Amour is constantly being mocked and put down by Lady Love. Poret's weaving through the erotic and the apophatic as the soul journeys out of itself and into divine love to be one soul being with God, has many echoes of the women mystics who were her contemporaries or preceded her, especially Hedwig of Antwerp and Mechthild of Magdeburg. Now, I'm not going to offer the sources, the very obvious sources for her ideas. You probably can recognize these instantly, but I just want to mention that her work is firmly rooted, it's firmly Pauline, and it's extremely Neoplatonic. Surprisingly, in Poret's mirror, divine love, the voice of God, is feminine. It's a nice touch, even though amour is masculine in French. In Meister Eckhart's explanation of the birth of the word of the soul, he also describes it as God's mother work, interestingly. Now, much has been written about this subversion of gender categories. What I find interesting is that reason is always subject to Lady Love. It's also interesting that this subversion somehow reflects, in a strange way, the title given to her by the inquisitors, pseudo-mulière. She couldn't really be a woman because she's written this stuff, and it's very theological and it's probably beyond the female mind. However, we shouldn't be tempted to conclude that hers is an affective, female-centered mysticism. It isn't really. But her mystical theology is, I believe, gendered. We shouldn't make too much of it. And despite her very powerful use of love imagery, the mirror is not bride mysticism or written under the impetus of Bernard of Clairvaux's love mysticism. Rather, it takes the basic themes of Dionysian negative theology and uses these to weave an altogether new garment. Her basic premise is the incomprehensibility of God. Nothing can be known of God outside of God. Whatever we know can be unsaid. Put simply, Poret's story in The Mirror is the story of the soul becoming what she truly is, strangely, by falling out of herself under the impetus of love. When the soul is liberated from will and reason, and when the soul has all and has nothing, knows all and knows nothing, wills all and wills nothing, the soul is so emptied that her divine lover has space to be in her, to be born in her. Broadly speaking, Porete conceives 7 stages in the soul's ascent, or in her case, descent into God, the final of which is the return to origin's bodily death. And of course, we can't say anything about that. I don't want to enumerate these here except to say that the soul practices a most radical apophatic as she takes her leave of everything, even the virtues. Freedom from being bound by the virtues is precisely what constitutes a liberated soul. And while this taking leave of the virtues was deemed to be part of her downfall, of which she refused to recant, to my mind it's not dissimilar from Augustine's love and do as you will, whom Porete quotes. Having left the virtues, the soul then literally falls into love, into God, because God is love. She says, and divine love tells me that she has entered within me, and so she can do whatever she wills. Most of her work is concerned with what she calls the 5th stage, when the soul becomes annihilated. The soul no longer sees herself or God, but rather God sees God in her, so that she sees that none is but God. God sees God's self through her in his divine majesty, so that she sees nothing outside of God himself. There is nothing but God. And it is through being loved by God that the soul falls into no-thingness, nothingness, because she is not the one doing the loving. Only love loves. In my view, this is the heart of Poret's apophaticism. It's a very Dionysian approach in that knowing nothing is the way to the unknowable God. Annihilated souls, she says, can no longer speak of God, for knowing no longer where God is, they can no longer say who God is. In Poret's dialectic, God, the bountiful outpouring of a manifest love, belongs to an unmanifest nothingness, which can be reached only by knowing nothing, willing nothing, and having no space for God. A motif that is repeated throughout the mirror. And here I think we see a very clear source for Eckhart's Beati Populi Spiritu sermon. She says, the soul has her right name from the nothingness in which she rests. And if she is unencumbered in all aspects, she loses her name. And therefore she loses her name in the one in whom she is melted and dissolved through himself and in himself. The intensity of the soul's love, which by its very nature is self-emptying, self-displacement, leads ultimately to the loss of self. In Porete's falling into God, her kenosis echoes the kenosis of divine love, whereby God creates because God is, as Dionysius put it, beguiled by goodness, by love, and by yearning. The ecstatic God, who stands outside God's self to create, calls us to answer with our own ecstatic yearning. Ecstasy then answers ecstasy. The Platinian, Dionysian, and Augustinian concept of love drawing all things to itself is a very strong motif in the mirror. For love draws all matter into herself. It's lovely to hear that herself there. Love and the soul become one thing, not two, because that would be discord. In the soul becoming annihilated, becoming nothing and other than itself, it can no longer know, because it is fully liberated from all things, even knowledge. As Lady Love says, such a soul swims in the sea of joy, in the delightful ebb and flow of the sea of the Godhead. But she does not feel joy because she is one with joy, for she dwells in joy and joy dwells in her. For love has changed this soul into herself. To which the soul responds, how sweet it is that I am changed into the thing that I love better than myself. I am so changed, I have lost my identity through love. In such a soul, then, God alone works. On my own, she says, I can do nothing unless my beloved loves in me. And in this way, annihilation, the ecstatic going out of oneself, of being beside oneself, becomes the portal through which the soul is transformed into God, into love. This poverty of self, of soul, this annihilation, is paradoxically how the soul gains God by losing God. And in the gaining and becoming love, the soul becomes free. Annihilation is necessary to expand the place where God can begin to be. The no-thingness that the soul becomes means that she is not with herself. She is a naked, no-thinged soul who has bid farewell to the world such that she can no longer even be found. A very similar concept to Eckhart's practice of Abgeschiedenheit. And in the mirror, it is through her own destruction that the soul becomes deified. As Lady Love says, the soul is God by the condition of love, and I am God by divine nature. That is why this precious beloved of mine is taught and brought by me without herself, for she is changed into me. And Porete then simply announces, the Trinity has made her its home. This soul is completely melted, liquefied, and absorbed in the High Trinity, joined and united to it, and she has no other will other than divine will. So, despite Porete's use of the language of love, an apophatic moment is always present in the soul's annihilation. So pure is her knowledge that she sees herself as nothing in God, and God as no thing in her. She is so small that she cannot be found, and God is so great that he is incomprehensible to her. By this nothingness, she has fallen into the certainty of knowing nothing and wanting nothing. And this nothingness gives her everything. God is, says Porete, known, loved and praised only by those creatures who cannot know, love, or praise God. She has nothing to do with God any more than God has to do with her. Why? Because he is, she is not. And in her nothingness, she needs nothing, for it is enough that he is and she is not. And so she is unburdened of all things, for she is again without being, just as it was before she was. She is what God is. She says, I am what I am. Therefore, I am only that and nothing else which God is in me. And God is also the same being that he is in me. Therefore, if I am nothing except what God is. There is nothing but God, so no matter where I go, I find nothing but God. And in this way, Porete is following in the same tradition of Mechthild of Magdeburg, Angela de Foligno, and Hadewich of Antwerp, who stated, Gott mit Gott te sinne, to be God with God. And among the men, of course, Eckhart and Rosebrooke. And as an illustration, Porete uses the very potent image of a river flowing into the sea. As a river, it has its name, it is the Seine, it is the Danube. But when it joins the sea, it loses its name. It simply becomes part of the sea. As she says with the soul, now it is sea resting. This rather lovely image, which describes the process of deification, is used on more than one occasion by Marguerite. Condemnations of this aspect of her thought concentrate on the idea that God's nature and the soul's nature become one in deification. I think we're probably agreed on this point. It's not problematic if we read it in the light of Philippians 1:23, I live no, not I, but Christ lives in me. Throughout centuries of patristic thought, the concept of God becoming human so that human could become God was easily accepted. And many ideas in Bernard of Clairvaux could easily be read with the Poretian lens, whereby the apophatic plunge into God becomes the expiration of the soul. But Porete's thought takes a more daring turn when she declares, God has no other place to put his goodness unless he places it in me. For this reason, I can say that I am the salvation of all creatures and the glory of God. In this way, God becomes in the soul. God plunges and descends into the soul who loves through God's love. Therefore, it is through me, going out of me, that God becomes. God pours God's self into me when I become not me. And Meister Eckhart goes even further when he says, God can do nothing without me. God, he says, loves so much that his life and his being depend on loving me. Where the creature stops, God begins to be. And while the soul must do the work of becoming empty and naked, it is God who completes the process, because the soul can no longer act. The soul knows nothing, not even God. And here we can clearly see the subjective and objective poles of apophatic discourse. The soul, the subject becomes object, and God, object, becomes subject. In this sense, the concept of theosis is an interior rather than an exterior happening, where God is paradoxically no longer telos, but starting point. God becomes to be in me. And God continually goes out from God's self and into the soul. And the continuous hominification of God and the divinization of humanity is the eternal process of love, loving love's self. She says, thought has no more lordship in her. She has lost the use of her senses, for love has carried her from the place where she was. This is the completion of her pilgrimage and the annihilation by her rendering of her will, which is dissolved in love. And as the mirror that is the soul becomes emptied, only the gazer remains, the gazer being love. And as Eckhart put it, in all creatures there is something of God, but in the soul God is very God, for she is his resting place. And he continues, that is why one master says, God loves nothing but himself. All his love is lavished on himself. This concept has had many expressions in different traditions. Listen to the Andalusian mystic Ibn Arabi's hadith. When I, Allah, love my servant, I become the hearing with which he hears, the seeing with which he sees, the hand with which he grasps, and the feet with which he walks. And in Plotinus, the seeing and the seen coincide, and the seen is like the seeing, and the seeing is like the seen. And in Eckhart, I love this one, the eye with which God sees me is the same eye with which I see God. My eye and God's eye are one eye, and one vision or seeing, and one knowledge, and one love. Again, a Dionysian conception of the love by which we love God being God's love. And finally, in Marguerite Porete, this soul sees neither God nor herself, but God sees himself, of himself, for her, without her, because she is literally beside herself with love. And the soul says, I have said that I will love him. I lie, for I am not. It is he alone who loves me. He is, and I am not. He is fullness, and by this I am pregnated with God. In Poret's understanding, as also in Eckhart, the annihilation of the self, the complete falling into God, can be understood as a return to her original primal, her before state. Soul becomes what she always was and is in the Godhead. This means that soul is truly in herself when she is nowhere in herself, not in God, not in herself, nor in her neighbors, but in the annihilation of herself. This idea is especially prominent in some of the German sermons of Meister Eckhart and in the Sister Catherine treatise for the Meister, when the soul becomes virgin, when the soul becomes empty and naked, disinterested, there is space for the word. And in a sense, without the soul, there would be no word. The performative act of being free from all locates the eternal everywhere and at once, in the same way that multiplicity in Plotinus is conceived of as a one everywhere. And for Eckhart, when the word is born, the soul knows nothing, has nothing, and wants nothing, as Marguerite Porete said before him. Both the Eckhart and Porete work a similar thematic. For the Dominican, the word is birthed in the soul when the soul becomes virgin. In a sense, the soul becomes the womb for God, becomes wife. For Marguerite, the annihilated soul becomes an empty shell that is transformed into the residence of love. And in both Porete and Eckhart, deification is accomplished by the outgoing of God and the descent, not the ascent of the soul. But this is not the end of the love story of the soul. She's not left bereft of herself in dark nothingness. Paradoxically, and as in all the great mystics, there are sudden moments of clarity and light. And although the soul remains annihilated, nothing, at times, she says, dazzling far near, loin près, flashes glory like the brightest of lightning. But she notes that these flashes are necessarily brief, because the soul cannot, as she says, bear that ravishing, overwhelming union which suddenly seizes her and joins her to the marrow of divine love, where she simply melts. More than this, she doesn't say. And in contrast to many of the practitioners of the apophatic way, Marguerite's journey, and indeed Eckhart's journey, is not presented as an ascent, but as a being still in no-thingness, the very Platonian notion of waiting quietly and then being suddenly exyphnes in the presence of the mighty good. And although the annihilated soul remains outside herself, Porete notes, she floats in a sea of contentment where she wafts and wanes, drifts and drowns in divine peace, not moving within and not working without. Meister Eckhart's famous living without a why is found in Porete when she simply notes, she has given up everything freely without asking why. She says, I rest in complete peace, alone, all and nothing, in the courtesy of the unique kindness of God. Let me conclude this presentation so we've some time for discussion. When I first read The Mirror of Simple and Annihilated Souls, I found the language and the style very off-putting. But when I got used to it and read the texts more closely, I began to see how far-reaching her spirituality really is. Her radical practice of apophatic, to the extent of self-annihilation, by becoming empty and naked through falling out of herself, I think that there she answers the divine call to remove, as Plotinus would say, all that we took on in our descent. In the mirror, the soul annihilates herself so completely that only God, only love remains. Negative theology usually practices an apophatic that entails the taking away from God of all that is considered creaturely. In the mirror, Porete's method focuses on the self rather than on God and proceeds to strip the self of all that is creaturely. This reversal leaves God to be God, just simply that, and concentrates on making the soul a fit residence for love. And in this way, I think Porete manages to rework the concept of purification in a most radical fashion. But she doesn't, like many of the practitioners of the Via Negativa, resolve, as it were, the problem of knowing God through unknowing knowing. Right to the end, the soul does not and cannot know God, because only God is. She may see a flash of loin près glory, but for the most part, she remains still and alone, not knowing anything, even herself, while love wills, acts, and loves in her. And just as I started with the Rumi quotation, I'll finish with Rumi. Knock, and he'll open the door. Vanish, and he'll make you shine like the sun. Fall, and he'll raise you to the heavens. Become nothing, and he will turn you into everything. Thank you. No matches?
No matches.
No matches, okay.
Thank you so much for this very interesting lecture and contribution to our project on understanding love. Now we open up for comments or questions.
Go easy because I'm in unknown territory. I can't really...
I'm sort of speechless, but thank you for a very beautiful lecture. More like a prelude to a meditation than to deep reflection. But still, I'm trained as a critical listener. And know two questions from an ethical point of view. First, in the first part of your lecture, I hear a very strong relational voice. Also, a voice which I can take into this world, into the meeting of the other in this existence, to give me right. And the next question, when it all ends in self-annihilation, and I hear your very strong feminine voice through the whole lecture, aren't you afraid that praising self-annihilation as a woman contribute to the annihilation of women once more in another way?
I'm not sure I read the work in that light, Paul. I think more that soul is feminine, but in Marguerite, Lady Love, the voice of God, is also feminine. And I think one of the things that really struck me is she's the boss of reason. In Meister Eckhart and Aquinas, in all the great masters of the time, reason was glorified as being the way we talk about God and so on. And I think because she puts reason down, she says, you silly thing, you think that, blah, 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 blah. You know, so I think basically in terms of this work, I don't think that's an issue. What I found most interesting, and maybe for you also, was her insistence on leaving the virtues behind. Because the virtues belong to little church, which is the church of the clerics, the church of rules and obligations and things like that. The church of liberated and annihilated free souls, the brethren of the free spirit and the Antinomian heresy and all the rest of it. That is the church for the liberated who have no need to go through men to God, but can go directly to Lady Love through loving. I think that turns the whole thing on its head a little bit.
And thank you very much for a wonderful paper.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed it. I have a remark and a question. The remark is regarding your reference to Bernard of Clairvaux. I think if I properly understood you, you mentioned him as a source for Dionysian and Greek mystical teaching. But there is a recent book actually showing that Bernard is not indebted to Greeks at all, that Augustine actually is his main source for mystical theology. Second thing, wonderful metaphors for this union. But I have a problem. You mentioned two. One is the river and sea, and the other is shell filled with love. Now I have in mind some Greek comparison. For example, in Maximus and earlier writers, you have very clear idea, and they use, for example, Maximus uses kind of Christological terms, adietos and asigitos, to undivided and unconfused, to describe the future union. Now, and he gives examples of iron and fire, and light and air, but you always there is no a division and there is no confusion. But when you mention sea and river, I have a problem. It looks like a confusion in some sort.
I think it is a confusion, but I think we're trying to go places where we can't go. Maximus talking about the iron and the fire and the air and the light and so on. That is precisely what you say. It is not confused, because it remains what it is. That's precisely why the lady was put to death.
Oh, really?
Because basically God and the soul become one, become conflated. I don't find it problematic. I find
About shell and filled with love, then you'll have form, you will have this. This is also like iron and
you
iron
do.
and
You do.
fire. Yeah.
The empty shell that the soul becomes by standing beside herself or outside of herself so that love can love basically means that the soul can do nothing. I live, no, not I, but Christ lives in me. Augustine as well, and so many of the Christian mystics. But the river flowing into the sea, I really like it, because why do I have to continue? Why should it be unconfused? Can't it be confused? I told you you'd be getting out your mouth.
No, of course, from this, because you can find that in Athanasius was not concerned with this. He's talking about God as ocean, really, but there is a different context. There's this infinite nature of it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Henny. Thank you. What I hear when I hear you speak, I think it has more to do with poetry, really, than theology in a way. Meaning that when we speak of God, you have to use metaphors, and then you can use any metaphor and everything is okay, and in some way it can be applied with words. What I was missing or wanting you to say something about when we speak of apophatic theology is that apophaticism is just one side of negative theology. The other side is cataphatic theology, because God is unknown in his essence, as the Orthodox theology says, but he is known. We know who God is through creation, through incarnation. And I think this has to, when we speak of theology, I think this has to be a part of it. Because then, if not, it becomes, well, we can speak in apophatic terms about anything. Everything that we can really express, we can use metaphors for it. But apophatic theology also has to have the cataphatic side with it.
I agree with you entirely, because that's why you say bright darkness, unmanifest, manifest, silent music, and I think no spiritual journey is the same, and I find hers quite interesting. I was fascinated by it as a complete standing beside oneself. But I think you're right. Otherwise, we have to say something. We have to use words, as Plotinus would say, they point vaguely at the mighty good, but, what do we know after that? Yeah. It would put all the clerics out of a job if we all went apophatic.
comments or? John, yes, of course.
Thank you very much for a wonderful lecture. Many things to think about. In the early part of the lecture, you mentioned several times the lover and the beloved, and you have this two-ness where you're meeting an other, and towards the end, then the river flows into the sea, and the other is gone, and they're both gone, and it's just something new, kind of. Do you see any? You talk about love as praxis, the practical love can't just be talked about; it has to be practiced. But do you lose that in the river flowing into the sea? How is this applicable in any way to married life, or to parents and children, or to loving your neighbor? Moving beyond the virtues, where you're not talking about actually loving existing bodies anymore. Can you relate to that at all, or say anything about that?
I think so, because I think when I displace myself to give my heart into the safekeeping of another, when I'm not thinking of myself in terms of married love or for a parental love for a child, that there's nothing left of me in one sense, because I have made my home in the heart of another. It's kind of diaspora of myself, the displacement of myself. I think the flowing of the river into the sea is kind of apt, because while all theology, all speaking about God, theologia, all thinking about God, all discourse about God is done from a human perspective, in one sense, the central reality of the incarnation remains. And negative theology doesn't do away with the centrality of the kenosis of God and our subsequent theosis, as Athanasius put it so rightly. So I'm not going to argue with Athanasius, who says that we become God. We get turned into God. Some of the contemporary New Age theology that is around, there's a lady called Sally MacFaig, who says we are all born from the ashes of dead stars, basically. That everything, all creation, ex nihilo is ex deo, so that when we get born, that we become something from God and then move back to. But what can we say about the moving back to God? What can we say about union with God? What can we say about mystical experience, except how we perceive it? And I think, as Henny said, we quite rightly use a lot of metaphor when we're talking about deification and unification of the soul with God. It's not something that we've done yet, is it? I don't know. Maybe some in this room have been there and done that, but for most of us, I don't think we've gotten there.